This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Attention at the Capitol will soon shift to when lawmakers may return for a special session to take care of unfinished business. Meanwhile, you may still be digesting all the things that happened this legislative session. Today, we want to focus on some of the environmental measures that made it through. You can join our conversation, too. Here's the number, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I want to welcome back to our studio Emily Lewis, Director of the Climate and Energy Analysis Center at the Acadia Center based here in Hartford. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here.
So one of the big winners of this legislative session was offshore wind power. Remind listeners what has been debated over the last year in terms of how Connecticut compares with some of our New England neighbors when we look at offshore wind commitments.
Sure. So Connecticut has waded into the offshore wind territory a little bit. In the last year, they committed to 300 megawatts, which was great. But compared to other states, Massachusetts at the time had 1,600 megawatts they had committed to. New York had committed to 9,000 megawatts. So in comparison to scale, Connecticut was a little bit farther behind. So this legislative session, a bill just passed committing Connecticut to 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So that really brings it up to pace with its neighbors. And it's a critical time to do so because now the industry is developing. We want to be in the race to make sure we get the economic development and the jobs that come along with all that offshore wind development.
Can you describe when we say 2,000 megawatts of power, what does that translate to?
It's big. So it's about 950,000 homes in the state of Connecticut. So that's a lot of homes to power. But just in terms of total electricity that the state consumes, it's about 30%. And in terms, Connecticut's a small state, so 2,000 megawatts is smaller than some of its neighbors in terms of absolute megawatts. But in terms of electricity consumed, it's actually the biggest commitment out of any state. So we're really leading here on the offshore wind front now in Connecticut because of this bill.
So when listeners hear about this commitment, it doesn't mean that we're going to have wind power next year. So talk us through what needs to happen before we actually see wind turbines operating many miles off our coastline.
Sure. It's a many-step process. So the bill passed, and so it required that within 2 weeks of the governor's signature, which happened last Friday, that a new request for proposals would be issued. So developers of offshore wind who have rights to the leases out in the federal waters you mentioned will submit bids, and then the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection will review those bids. And there's a environmental stakeholder group that also is involved in that as well as part of the bill. So then the project is selected, they have to get federal permits, and then they have to build them. And there are limitations around building times because of the wildlife protections in place. So because of the whales, you can only build in certain seasons. So it's a multi-year process to even get them built. So we're looking probably at 3 to 5 years, probably closer to the 5-year timeline before they're actually up and operational once the bid is selected.
When we think about wind power, remind us in our nation where we see some of these wind farms in New England. It's actually pretty small right now.
It's very small. The only U.S. offshore wind turbine installation is off the coast of Rhode Island. It's the Block Island Wind Farm, and it's only 5 turbines. It's about 30 megawatts. So it's almost like a pilot project. It was really just like, we can do this in the U.S. Look at these turbines. They're doing great. And so I think once that project was built, all the states started to realize how awesome offshore wind was and made these commitments. And so now Connecticut's getting in the game, too.
This is Where We Live. In studio with me, Emily Lewis, Director of the Climate and Energy Analysis Center at the Acadia Center based in Hartford. We're taking a look at some of the environmental measures that made it through this legislative session. You can join us, too, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You mentioned the timing is important when we look at that the federal government, and even in terms of tax credits, what's at stake if we didn't have this commitment to get developers interested in production.
Right. That was one of the reasons the bill included that 2-week request for proposal kickoff when the bill was signed, is because there are federal tax credits expiring at the end of this year. And if the project is not selected by the end of the year and sort of on the books, they're not eligible for those tax credits. So it's really important that we get the first one out the door now. And then it's not likely going to be all 2,000 megawatts this year selected. So there will be future projects that will not be eligible for those tax credits unless there's a federal action to extend them.
How does this all play into Millstone and its operations?
That was another part of the thinking on the 2030 date. So it's 2,000 megawatts by 2030 in the bill. Millstone has 2 units, the first of which goes offline in 2035, and the second goes offline in 2045. I should say their licenses expire at those dates. They could possibly extend their licenses for another 20 years, but it's likely they'll close at those dates just because of it's an unprecedented process to extend beyond their original licenses there. So if offshore wind, if we have 2,000 megawatts solicited by 2030, it will be hopefully up and running more or less by 2035 when that first unit goes offline. So Millstone, while it has waste issues, doesn't produce carbon dioxide when it generates power. So if we were to lose that plant and have it replaced with natural gas, we would gain carbon dioxide emissions in Connecticut, which is the wrong direction right now. So by getting this offshore wind online on approximately the same timeline, we'd really be replacing zero carbon generation with other zero carbon generation.
And that's important with RGGI. Can you remind us what that is?
Right. RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So it is a program to reduce carbon emissions in the generation sector. And so it sets a cap at the maximum level of emissions that you can have in the region, and it reduces that cap every year. And so power generators have to buy credits, and there are credits sold up to that cap. So in order to maintain compliance with RGGI, generators have to buy those credits. And if Millstone were to go offline, suddenly Connecticut would have to buy a lot more credits, and they might be unavailable or more expensive, but they would have to do it to remain within the RGGI cap.
So this is all important, but also when lawmakers look at the economic impact of offshore wind, including helping to make the New London Pier a place where these wind turbines could be transported?
Yeah, so the governor, in collaboration with some industry partners, including the offshore wind developers, recently announced a public-private partnership on the order of $93 million to redevelop the New London State Pier for offshore wind activities. And I think they're still in the planning phases about what that might look like, or at least it's not super public what that might look like, but it's designed to be a staging area for offshore wind development, not only for Connecticut and the offshore wind we've just committed to, but the whole region, because they're all being built in these federal lease areas that are, off the coast quite a ways. So one of the attractive pieces of the New London port area was that there's no overhead restrictions. So I think part of the plan is to build taller things and actually float them out there. So maybe that's the basis. I think part of the development as well could look at filling in area between the two piers. I've seen some drawings that show that, or different dredging of the river to make it more accessible for the offshore wind development.
And when we think about jobs, how will that impact local residents? Is it a lot of jobs?
It could be a lot of jobs. Acadia Center looked at this a little bit last year when we put out our memo to the next Connecticut governor. And we found that 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind would generate something like 2,000 jobs for the state of Connecticut. But as the supply chain industry comes to the region and all these states have their other commitments, we're small states. There's not a lot of, there's not a hard border between them. So it will sort of rise all tides and could create tens of thousands of jobs, I think, between the different states.
You can join our conversation here on Where We Live, 860-275-7266. Arturo's calling from Hamden. Arturo, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Am I on air now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. Just quickly, I'm interested in finding out what these offshore windmills, wind power, well, it's great news and it's good to go green. My concern is what's the impact on local marine life? I remember reading that the breeding dynamics of whales off the coast of Massachusetts, the noise of the underwater could be stressful for them, and so this is just something I would like to hear some feedback or information in regards to what we're doing to prevent that or minimize it.
Well, thank you, Arturo, for your question. Something that, there are many local residents who think about marine life and the impact. What do we know? You mentioned whales earlier.
Right. So when they did the Block Island Wind Farm, they had periods of time that they were not allowed to do construction because of the whales, and I believe their migration or breeding habitats or breeding patterns. I also know they had to restrict activities if they saw a whale, and there was some radius on where they could pass through, and they had to stop activities. There's also been a recent partnership between the National Wildlife Federation and Vineyard Wind in construction of the Massachusetts project, just, again, ensuring those whale protections. And then a final piece that Connecticut committed to in the bill was the developers have to talk about how they're going to use best practices to mitigate environmental damages during construction. So it's like built into the development process here in Connecticut, and the other states have different protections as well. But it is a concern, and we want to be balancing all these activities. But I think as long as we're doing it smartly and building it in from the get-go so developers know they can plan for it and budget for it, that's important.
Again, we're looking at environmental legislation to come out of the Connecticut General Assembly over the last session. You can join our conversation if you have a question, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My in-studio guest, Emily Lewis, director of the Climate and Energy Analysis Center at the Acadia Center in Hartford. So from offshore to solar metering, tell us more about what was included in this bill, the Green New Economy Bill.
Right. So the short answer is the Green New Economy Bill reset net metering in the state of Connecticut to allow it to go forward for the next couple years, and it reversed some of the bad provisions that were enacted last year through legislation. And so those were, last year the bill, it was called SB 9, it undid net metering in a couple of ways. The first way is it changed, it put in place two provisions. One was called buy all, credit all, which means that instead of being able to consume the solar from your roof, and then at the end of the month, everything you sell is credited against what you consumed. So that's netting, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of that, you would have to sell everything you generate to the grid and buy everything back at the retail rate. And you would be credited at probably less than the retail rate through this process set in place by that bill. So it really changed the economics that customers would be eligible for. The other option put in place by the bill was netting that was less than 1 month. So instead of being netted at the period of your bill, it would be netted at periods 1 day or less. And again, just by shortening that netting period, you're changing the economics for customers because you're netting over fewer kilowatt hours. And again, you'd be getting less for those kilowatt hours that you are selling. So those changes really changed the economics for customers. And because of that bill, there were some proceedings that happened through the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And it turned out that these were not going to be a good deal for customers. So we came back here in the 2019 legislative session and were able to get this legislation through that put back those good provisions. So we now have net metering through the end of 2021, and we put in place a process to determine how net metering could evolve over time to address some of the concerns that the original bill was supposed to address. So we're looking at the value of solar. And so when you put solar on your roof, there's the carbon dioxide savings value. There's the value in terms of not having to build another big power plant. But there's also, costs associated with that. You have to have poles and wires to support that solar technology that you're not necessarily paying for if you're crediting. So looking at the total value, both in terms of cost and benefits, from that information, you can then go forward to develop a better solar policy for the state. So that process was put in place by the new bill that was just passed this session.
Emily, what are some ways that consumers can figure out if this is a good idea for them? Because it's a lot of, as you mentioned, like looking at a savings and also cost. So where can they go to get more information if solar is right for them?
Yeah, so Connecticut Green Bank has partnered with a website called Energy Sage, and it's sort of a clearinghouse for solar information. So I am a relatively new homeowner, so we're looking at putting solar on our roof. So this is where I went to, following through the link on the Green Bank. And what you can do is you put in information like how much electricity you use per month, what your electricity bill is per month, and how much, they can determine how much solar you need based on that information. And so once you know how much solar you need, different developers will give you quotes based on that information. And so I think I got back 5 or 6 quotes or something like that from all different developers who would use certain types of panels for certain amounts of energy. And they also provide different financing terms. So, a 7-year loan or a 5-year loan, how much money down, all of those types of financing things that finance people get excited about.
Another choice that consumers are making are making sure that if they have to drive, it's going to be an electric vehicle. There's something in the legislative session that could help increase the number of people both using electric vehicles for personal use, but also for the state fleet as well?
That's right. So the bill included 2 provisions. One was creating a steady funding stream for the electric vehicle rebate program. So right now, Connecticut does have a rebate program for regular consumers to purchase an electric vehicle, and the amount varies based on the size of the battery itself. But this created a $3 million funding stream for funding that rebate program going forward. So that's probably 2-ish years of funding. So that's really great. Previously, the state, to their credit, has managed to fund the program steadily, but it's been with different settlement dollars from utility settlements. So it's been hard to maintain that going forward. And then the other piece that passed in the legislation was a requirement that the state fleet purchase 50% of all light-duty vehicles be electric by 2030, and then 30% of all bus purchases would be electric by 2030. And so that's, the state making a commitment to moving towards electric vehicles in the future. There's some argument that those targets could be stronger. Maybe it should be that 30% of the total bus fleet should be electric rather than just 30% of purchases be electric, for example, by 2030. But it's great that the state's moving in the right direction, and we're happy to see these kind of commitments on the books.
So overall, a good session for environmental concerns, but anything that the lawmakers missed their mark on?
Sure. There's one piece. So again, in Acadia Center's memo to the next governor we put out last fall, we talked about offshore wind, distributed solar, and energy efficiency as sort of the three main components of developing a green energy economy and creating jobs through clean energy. And so energy efficiency was not rated this year, so that is definitely a good thing. However, there was a lot of hope in the advocacy community that the fund raid for 2019 would actually be restored in this legislative session, and it was not. So we're still working at a deficit through the 2019 year, but come 2020, we should be back to regular funding because that was not rated for the next 2 years. So we're happy. We're moderately disappointed about that, but still happy that we have energy efficiency going forward.
Well, Emily Lewis, thank you again for breaking that down for us here on Where We Live. Emily's director of the Climate and Energy Analysis Center at the Acadia Center in Hartford. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks very much.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to return to offshore wind power and learn about how this technology relies on the mining of certain metals known as rare earth elements. Now, what are the consequences of clean energy on certain communities? We're going to find out. You can join us too, 860-275-7266, or as always, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We just heard how Connecticut is joining other New England states in expanding its commitment to offshore wind power. Now, wind power is the largest source of renewable energy in the U.S., but how does the technology work? And what are the ramifications for certain communities which mine the materials for offshore wind? Joining us to tell us more from Mix One Studios in Boston is Dr. Julie Klinger, assistant professor at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, co-director of the BU's Land Use and Livelihoods Initiative, and author of Rare Earth Frontiers, From Subterranean Soils to Lunar Landscapes. That sounds pretty interesting. Julie, welcome to our show today.
Thanks so much.
So I mentioned rare earth elements or metals. So tell us more about which ones we're talking about and why they're important for offshore wind power.
Okay. All right. So the term rare earths refers to 17 chemically similar elements that are found between numbers 57 and 71 on the periodic table. And we're not talking about all of those for rare earth elements. We're only talking about a couple that are used in wind turbines. And the principal ones that we're talking about are called neodymium and dysprosium. And the important thing to clear up right away is that even though these things are called rare earth elements, they aren't actually rare. The ones that we use most commonly, in addition to neodymium and dysprosium, like lanthanum and cerium, which we use for a variety of technological applications, are actually about as common as copper or lead. Now, when it comes to building a wind turbine, there are some wind turbines out there. If you have a 2 megawatt or a 3 megawatt wind turbine, you might need anywhere between 500 to 2,000 pounds of rare earth elements. And what are they used for? They are actually used for magnets in the wind turbines, right? So the thing that's actually generating the energy as the wind turbine spins around requires these elements.
When we think about renewable power sources and these magnets that are used to help operate turbines, but also in the fossil fuel industry, they're using rare earth elements as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the important thing to be clear about, right? If we talk about the environmental impacts of where we get these rare earth elements, we have to be absolutely clear on the fact that the problem of social and environmental impacts of mining rare earth elements did not begin with renewable energy tech, right? Certain rare earth elements are used in petroleum refining. Others are used to produce the super strong alloys that are used to build pipelines so they're safe and don't burst. Basically, if you look around you, just about every piece of hardware in modern life uses or relies on rare earth elements in some way.
When we talk about rare earth metals, where primarily are they being mined, Julie?
Well, the largest rare earth mine in the world is located in northern China, in Inner Mongolia. And this single mine is the source of about 40 to 50% of all rare earth elements consumed globally. Most refined rare earth oxides, right? So this is after this is several steps down the chain after you dig the stuff out of the ground and you process it and you throw away the stuff you don't want and you just get the stuff that you want. Most of that stuff comes from China not because China has the largest deposits of rare earth elements, but because China has built up over the past several decades the greatest industrial capacity for actually processing these things and converting them into things we use, like magnets, for example. So
production's cheaper and easier in China?
Certainly cheaper. I mean, production is complicated wherever you do it.
So you've actually, been to China and spent much time there looking at the communities that are where these elements are being mined. Tell us about what you found when you went there.
Okay. So between 2010 and 2013, I was a regular visitor to Baotou and Baiyun Obo, and these are called locally the rare earth capital of the world. And you notice two things. One, Baotou is quickly transforming from a northern frontier town into a glistening metropolis, like many cities in China. But it is also heavily polluted, right? The soil and water surrounding the old industrial zone around the city have become so polluted that, in fact, they'll no longer support agricultural production, or to the extent that people still do grow food in the areas around the city, it is actually contaminated with pollution from the industry. People who live immediately downstream of the mine itself have had to deal with the health impacts for a couple of generations. And one of the, I think, most striking things that I noticed when I was there is that after a while, you can tell who grew up immediately downstream of the mine or the industrial facility by looking at them, right? Because they often have skin lesions or what look like bone deformities, which is in fact skeletal fluorosis. And this comes as a result not from exposure to the rare earth elements themselves, but exposure to all the other things that are brought up with rare earth elements, like arsenic, fluoride, and other radioactive materials.
So when people learn about this, do they see that as an argument against clean energy?
Sometimes. I think that there are a handful of dare I say, bad faith arguments out there that call this, there's been headlines to the effect of, that this is, quote unquote, green energy's dirty little secret. But here's the thing. We also use rare earth elements to build our fiber optic cables, to build suspension bridges, to, give glassware a lovely pink color, right? So we already had this environmental challenge of how we source our critical materials and whether we're sourcing them in a socially and environmentally sustainable way, long before we even started talking about this critical transition to a new green economy. So I think the key thing to take away here is that we can use our green transition as an opportunity to address the supply chain issues, right? To make sure that our green technology is actually truly green, right? But if we don't look at our supply chain issues, if we don't make sure that, the entire life cycle of renewable energy technology is in fact green and sustainable and socially and environmentally friendly, then we could be looking at a scenario where renewable energy deployment does exacerbate the problem.
Dr. Julie Klinger is assistant professor at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, also co-director of BU's Land Use and Livelihoods Initiative, and author of Rare Earth Frontiers: From Subterranean Soils to Lunar Landscapes. We're learning more about some of the technology metals that many products rely on, including the metal that helps with the magnets used in these large turbines that are being developed for offshore wind. You can join our conversation if you have a question question about rare earths. The number 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Julie, tell us more about when we think about ways to better acquire these rare earth elements, something called flex mining. Can you talk us through some of the options that industry should be thinking about?
Oh, absolutely. So there are a number of ways to tackle this problem. And, I'll just use, the recent policy changes in Connecticut, for example, right? So Connecticut just made this fabulous commitment to 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind. That's great, right? So assuming they use a fleet of wind turbines that actually uses rare earth elements, we're looking at, something on the order of, 400 and 500 tons. Metric tons of rare earth elements that'll need to be used in order to deploy these things. Now, that's both a lot and a little bit of the total global production, right? Total global production of rare earth elements really isn't more than 150,000 tons per year. Sounds like a lot, but if you compare it to things like iron, right, it's really just a drop in the bucket. And so we could imagine, right, what a paradigm shift it would be if say Connecticut were to require that raw materials that go into the wind turbines were sourced from certified sustainable or net zero or otherwise certified facilities, right? There's ways to support manufacturers with tax incentives to do this. And one easier way to actually get these rare earth elements in a more environmentally friendly way is through the practice of flex mining. So this means that one mining facility is used for multiple things. Now, often, if you open a silver mine or a lead mine or even a rare earth mine, you're bringing up all sorts of other good, potentially useful stuff. The actual element that you're after may only be 2 or 3 or 4% of the total material that you're bringing up. And so we have all over the world, all over North America, these old or closed down mine sites. And there's this lingering problem there of, tailings ponds or mine waste that could actually be a potentially immense resource of rare earth elements and other critical materials, simply because these things were brought up and they weren't used, right? Because the company was there mining for something else. So if we use flex mining, we're looking at a potentially really exciting paradigm shift where instead of digging new holes in the ground to get the critical elements we need in order to achieve widespread deployment of renewable energy technology, we would instead be killing two birds with one stone effectively, because we would be reducing the overall waste footprint of our current and dormant mining facilities while also meeting our needs for these critical materials. All of this, of course, requires public support for the suppliers. It requires policy support, tax incentives for the manufacturers in order to make this happen. But considering the scale of the climate challenge we are facing, I don't think it's anything we can't do.
What about possibilities for reuse and recycling, Julie, for what's already being used in tech production?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So currently, here's the thing. We throw away thousands of tons annually of critical materials, not just rare earth elements, but also critical technology metals, right? Every time we get rid of a laptop, every time we decommission an airplane, right? Every time we break a cell phone and toss it away, every time we lose our earbuds, what we're doing is we're discarding critical technological materials. Now, here's the thing. We already know what it takes to recycle our electronic waste, right? We already have the technological know-how. What we do not have is the social infrastructure in place in order to collect things as diverse as, old laptops and, spent jet or old decommissioned jet airplane engines, right? But to me, that's actually the easier part of the puzzle. Right, we have the technological know-how figured out. All we have to do is put together a collection and recycling system, which actually, if you think about it, over the past 30 to 40 years, we've managed to do with a number of other things already in this country, from bottle and can to compost.
You can join our conversation as we learn more about rare earth elements behind some of the technologies we use today. My guest, Julie Klinger, assistant professor at Boston University's Party School of Global Studies. Again, you can find Where We Live on Facebook and Twitter. Just search at Where We Live. Jordan's calling in from Bridgeport. Jordan, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'm an engineer who works in the wind energy industry, also a BU alum, as your guest is. And my question is regarding the use of rare earth materials in conventional forms of electricity generation, such as natural gas. I think, is it maybe unfair to say that only renewable energy needs these rare earth materials when, in fact, conventional sources such as natural gas, which I think is scheduled to continue to displace coal power going forward, these conventional sources also need the renewable, the rare earth materials. So it's not only a renewable energy problem. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, we did bring that up, Jordan, but I'll let my guest, Julie, expand on that.
Yeah, fabulous. I think that's so important to be absolutely clear about that any form of energy generation that we're talking about, whether it's natural gas, whether it's conventional other forms of conventional fossil fuels, or whether it's renewable energy, requires rare earth elements or other critical technology metals. So the thing that we need to be really clear about is that the social and environmental challenges that come with getting the raw materials we need to generate the energy we need did not begin with renewable energy technology, right? I will say, though, that we have to be a little bit maybe on the offensive against arguments that are presenting green energy as somehow creating the problem. Right? So I completely agree with you. Thank you for that comment.
We've been focusing on some of the field research that you did earlier in China, Julie, but also in Latin America, there are places where communities are sitting atop these rare earth materials, and the impact, is it the same there?
Well, it's interesting. So the other place where I've spent a bit of time over the past several years is in the northwestern Brazilian Amazon. And this is an area that is majority indigenous. Most of the land is protected either as conservation areas or as constitutionally demarcated indigenous land. So what this means is you absolutely cannot engage in any sort of mining in these territories. However, in the 70s, some fairly substantial deposits of niobium and rare earths were identified in the region and then forgot about for a long time. And then in 2010, when the world sort of woke up initially to the importance of rare earth elements to everyday life, there was this renewed gold rush or interest, so to speak, in quote unquote liberating these resources from underneath the feet of indigenous people. Now, this is where practices like flex mining and recycling and requiring environmentally superior certifications from suppliers is really important. Because if we don't require that our rare earth elements and other critical materials such as niobium are sourced in a socially and environmentally sustainable way, what that does is that incentivizes, right, small-scale, illegal and clandestine medium to large-scale miners to go into these areas and wreak all sorts of havoc because they're effectively operating outside of the oversight of the state or the military in order to meet increasing global demand. Right. So it may seem like it's a complex picture with a lot of moving parts, but actually it's actually pretty simple. If we don't take care of sustainably and responsibly sourcing these things, that then pushes prospecting and production into socially and environmentally protected or vulnerable areas.
And that can lead to deforestation?
Absolutely, yes. And if we were to find ourselves in this scenario where all of a sudden we started sourcing rare earth elements from other parts of Latin America as opposed to from China, and we didn't look after the social and environmental conditions at the point of origin, we could find ourselves in this crazy situation where we're deploying renewable energy technology here in order to mitigate climate change, but in fact we're exacerbating it by diminishing the capacity of one of the largest carbon sinks on land, which is the Amazon rainforest, to effectively sequester CO2. I mean, currently, the Amazon basin is responsible for about 25% of carbon sequestration globally. And we really need every bit of that carbon sequestration if we have any hope of keeping temperature rise at a reasonable level.
Before we head into break, Julie, going back to China being a large exporter and also working with production of rare earth elements there, how does this trade war between U.S. and China impact the industry?
Well, I think that there's been an awful lot of smoke and not a whole lot of fire. People made an awful lot of Xi Jinping's visit to a rare earth magnet facility in China a couple weeks ago. The discourse has kind of run away with itself. Currently, the U.S. doesn't really import that much of rare earth oxides. What we actually import are the various technological components that contain rare earth oxides. So things like magnets, things like components for various technologies, and other things like that. So unless the Chinese government starts talking about restricting export to the U.S. of those sorts of technological components, I think that actually the concerns are a little overblown. And
that happened before in 2011, and the countries were able to work around that?
Yes. So in 2011, there were a couple of shipments of rare earth oxides that were held up, right? They were intended for Japan. And the ships weren't really allowed to leave one particular port in eastern China. And nobody really knew this was happening until Japanese customs inquired at China's customs authority after the missing shipments. But that's not the story that was told. The story that was told at the time was that China embargoed rare earth elements to Japan, which is something that one government does against another during a time of war. That's not at all what happened. But nevertheless, markets reacted accordingly, and the prices for some rare earth elements like neodymium and dysprosium increased by as much as 2,000%. Right. And so that really shocked the world into the importance of these elements in everyday life, and particularly in renewable energy generation.
Julie Klinger, again, is professor at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, author of the book Rare Earth Frontiers from Subterranean Soils to Lunar Landscapes. Julie, we thank you for joining us today from Boston.
All right. Thank you.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Up next, gardens and fields are popping with color this time of year, but a new report warns New England is losing many species of wildflowers. We'll learn more after the break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, several times on the show, we've talked about the importance of native plants in your gardens. Now we know more about what's at stake with a new paper out on native wildflower loss in New England. The lead author joins me now by phone, Dr. Caitlin McDonough-McKenzie, who's the David H. Smith Conservation Researcher at the University of Maine and lead author on this recent paper. Caitlin, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So tell us, how did you start on this project, and how far back did you rely on historical botanist records?
Yeah, I started this project as a PhD student at Boston University, and the timing was perfect because I arrived at Acadia National Park in 2011, right after this wonderful book, Plants of Acadia National Park, was published in 2010, and that was this beautiful catalog of every plant in Acadia National Park. And this area has been just incredibly exciting for botanists for many, many years. And in 1894, there was a flora from Mount Desert Island, which is where Acadia National Park is, that was published as the result of 14 years of fieldwork that was started when the first botanist was a undergraduate in college. He was doing some summer exciting natural history work on the island. And so when I arrived in Acadia National Park in 2011, I had the 1894 flora that cataloged every species on the island, and I had a 2010 flora that cataloged every species on the island. And my job was to go through and connect the dots. So it was a lot like trying to study a makeover, where I had the before picture and I had the after picture, and I needed to quantify what had happened to each of these plant species.
So the recent study finds 1/4 of native New England wildflower species have been lost in the last 150 years. So when we're talking about native species, tell us which ones are most vulnerable.
Sure. So we got that number 1/4 by looking at 13 different places where we had that kind of makeover data set, where we had the earlier flora and the current flora. And so we looked at these 13 sites across New England, and the rate of species loss ranged from just under 4% in the Finger Lakes in New York to over 50% in Staten Island, but that average was 25%. And we noticed that there are some plant families, like orchids and lilies, that are especially vulnerable. So, for example, on Mount Desert Island, there were 21 species of orchids in 1894. 9 of those have now become locally extinct, and another 8 have declined in abundance. And similarly, in the lilies, there were 7 species that were recorded in 1894. 3 of them are now lost from the island, and another 4, they haven't declined in abundance, but they haven't increased in abundance either.
And when we think about non-natives that are crowding in, which ones are you and your other researchers seeing?
So, for example, again, in Mount Desert Island, we found things like purple loosestrife and Japanese knotweed, which were not present in the flora in 1894, and those are now common species on Mount Desert Island.
So when we think about some of the causes behind this, is it hard to pinpoint, or what are some of the things that you've learned, Caitlin?
It is definitely hard to pinpoint. There's been a lot of change going on in the region over the last 100 years, from really small-scale things like local development, deer browsing, to bigger, more regional issues like air pollution, to global issues like climate change. And all of those are working together. So it was beyond the scope of our paper to point to any one individual plant and say, that was acid rain, and that one we lost because we built a parking lot. But really pointing out this really broad picture where we have these 13 sites from across the region. Some of them are conservation land. Some of them are counties or towns. And across all these different types of habitats and types of sites, we're seeing this general pattern of species loss and decline. And that points to a broader set of causes. It's not just something local that's happening in each of these 13 sites individually.
Caitlin, tell our listeners what's at stake when we hear about 1/4 of these native plants disappearing in such a widespread area, and how that impacts our local ecosystems.
Absolutely. Plants are not just the green backdrop or the habitat for our charismatic wildlife. They provide a lot of ecosystem services for us. And people have very intense relationships with plants, even if you don't think that you do at first blush. So another project that I'm working on, Plant Love Stories, collects the stories of people's interactions with plants. And so we have everything from people's gardens to the plants that their grandmothers had in their gardens growing up, favorite foods, plants that inspired research, maple syrup. And through this collection of different plant love stories, we've seen that humans have really special plants in our lives. And so losing this biodiversity is losing opportunities for more of these plant love stories to come alive.
You mentioned the plants that people have an affinity for, such as?
For example, I really love alpine plants. I love working above tree line. So I'm a big fan of things like diapensia and Labrador tea.
I'm going to have to look that up. Caitlin, when we were talking about earlier about some of the historical records that you were going through, was it difficult when we think about the time that these botanists were recording, that the data that you were able to look at were primarily from men, and the fact that botanists were many different types of people, and how do you can try to glean as much information from these certain pockets, if you will?
Sure. So I worked with this flora from 1894, and it was started and published by a Harvard undergraduate, Edward Rand. But he made a point of reaching out to other botanists and kind of collecting this group of collaborators around him, including women like Annie Sawyer Downs, who was a pretty well-known botanist in the area, although she didn't become a co-author on his project. And it's around the same time at the end of the 19th century that science is professionalizing. And so part of the professionalization was it became a men's-only kind of club. And so we have this really great data set from the botanists who were working and had recognition within the community, and their works were archived, and their herbarium specimens were kept at universities. And we know that at the same time, many other people were looking at plants. They just didn't happen to be wealthy white men. And so their records didn't survive, or their records were not kept in a way that was recognized by science. And so we're really only looking at just the smallest snapshot of historical data that's available. And I wanted to keep in mind that people like Annie Sawyer Downs were there doing the work alongside of them, but they didn't always make it into the record books.
Before we go, if our listeners want to learn more about this recent study, where can they go, Caitlin?
We published this in Rhodora. It's the Journal of the New England Botanical Club, which was actually founded by Edward Rand, one of those early botanists. And there's also plantlovestories.com, which collects the plant love stories of people in the working, living, and interacting with plants today.
Well, we appreciate your time with us here on Where We Live. Again, Dr. Caitlin McDonough-McKenzie, who's the David H. Smith conservation researcher at the University of Maine. She's the lead author on this recent paper about native wildflower loss in New England. And we'll try to also link to some of our past shows where we focused on the importance of native plants in your backyard. But Caitlin, thank you for joining us today here on Where We Live.
Thank you so much.
Today's show was produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. Our digital producer is Carlos Mejia. And special thanks to our new crop of interns. You can also go to our website, WNPR.org/wherewelive for more about the show. And this programming note, guess what? I'm hosting the Wheelhouse tomorrow while both John Dankosky and Colin McEnroe get a jump start on their summer tans. Hope you'll join me tomorrow as we talk to a wicked smart panel about the latest news, including UTC's plans to move its headquarters to Boston. Again, you can join the Wheelhouse tomorrow at 9 here on WNPR, Connecticut Public Radio. As always, thanks for listening.